Imagine a moment when everything is going according to plan, but suddenly the world is turned upside down. Today we will tell you about a situation that starts with bullying and humiliation and ends with the cold realization of a cruel mistake. The waitress didn't even realize that the person she was rude to was not just another customer, but the owner of the very establishment she was working in. What happened next keeps you in suspense until the last few minutes. Before we get started, we really need to know about you. Write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching this video from. We're grateful to each and every one of you. Your support helps our channel grow and share even more amazing stories. You are our strength and inspiration, and we will never stop appreciating having you with us. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions aren't just numbers. It's our interaction and trust that drives us forward. Thank you for sticking with us. Enjoy the show. Ember Dining Restaurant in the city center always attracted a diverse crowd, from businessmen to ordinary couples who dropped in for dinner after a long day at work. This evening, the atmosphere was familiarly lively, with the clinking of glasses, muffled conversations, and the smell of fresh spices and roasted meat wafting through the air. Waitress Christine was one of the best employees, but not for her kindness or professionalism. She was characterized by bold confidence and a piercing gaze that often left guests feeling slightly uncomfortable. Her long hair, gathered in a straight bun, perfectly ironed white apron, emphasizing her slender figure, and red lipstick on her lips, everything in her appearance screamed of strictness and coldness. But behind this outward austerity was a contempt for those she considered inappropriate or unacceptable for such a place. When the restaurant door opened and a man in a dark blue suit with light signs of age on his face walked in, Christine gave him her first glance, a scanning and appraising one. The man was tall, with short cropped hair and dark skin. His posture and confident gait spoke of a man accustomed to respect. His under-faintly lowered eyelids slid across the hall with an invisible smile. For Christine, however, that first glance was enough to make an internal verdict. Probably a casual visitor or someone who can't afford anything more than a glass of water, she thought. Feeling a slight pang of irritation, complicating the situation was the fact that she remembered the manager's remarks about the need to be polite to all customers, and she didn't like that. Her gaze grew a little harder as the man sat her down at one of the tables in the corner, away from the noise. What Christine didn't know was that this visitor wasn't just a casual guest. His name was Michael Lawrence, and he was the man behind every detail of this restaurant. From the interior design to the elaborate menu, everything was the realization of his aspirations and dreams. Michael loved anonymity and would sometimes check on his employees under the guise of a regular customer. From the moment he walked in, Michael had already begun to notice small things: the expression on the staff's faces, the way the food was served, the level of service. He glared at Christine, noticing the look, struggled to hold back a slight grimace of displeasure. Again, someone who will demand attention without reason, she thought, heading toward him with a cold smile. Christine moved toward the table with a posture of deliberate importance. She adjusted her apron and pressed her lips together in a tone of irritation. As she approached Michael, she stopped a couple steps farther away than usual, avoiding any hint of affability. At that moment, her look of disdain said more than any words could. She felt that this man was taking a seat that could have belonged to a more suitable customer. "You want a menu," Christine said, putting into her words the very intonation that makes an ordinary question offensive. She placed the menu in front of Michael with a thud, as if to show him that it was an unnecessary favor. Michael nodded restrainedly, his eyes scrutinizing her every move, but his face remained calm. He noticed the way her fingers tensed into fists, the way she struggled to keep herself from saying something even more blunt. Christine's next move, however, was even more blatant. Without waiting for his response, she crossed her arms over her chest and stood looking down at him. "Why don't you just tell me what you're going to order? Or do you need time to think about it?" She paused, as if expecting him to be confused or to ask for a clue. Her tone was filled with such condescension that the nearest customers looked at her warily. When Michael quietly asked for a glass of water, Christine's eyes flashed with hidden irritation. She hummed, turning to abruptly to comply with the simple request. When she returned, she deliberately delayed serving the drink, chatting with her coworkers and laughing, as if purposely demonstrating that this customer meant nothing to her. Placing the glass of water in front of Michael, she spilled some of the liquid on the table and didn't even think to apologize. Instead, her lips stretched into a slight grin. "Oh, it happens," she said, taking no action to clean up the puddle. Leaning a little closer, she added, "Are you okay? I'm here if you need me." There was so much fake concern in her voice that Michael could have responded, but he remained silent, maintaining a nonchalant expression. Tension hung in the air, barely perceptible, but palpable to everyone in the vicinity. Christine, convinced that she was right, didn't bother to pay attention to the many small details that might have made her wonder about the visitor situation. To her, Michael remained just a stranger, not worthy of her time and attention. His behavior, however, spoke volumes to someone who could see a little deeper than the superficial. The first thing she didn't notice was his suit. At first glance it might have seemed ordinary, but an experienced eye would have immediately recognized that the fabric was expensive and the cut was impeccably tailored. This suit was not just clothes, but part of the image of a successful man, accustomed to a high standard of living. The engraved silver cufflinks glittered on his wrist, another sign Christine had noticed. When Michael asked for a glass of water, his voice was soft but confident, which was rare among the customers who came to the restaurant just to eat. He was careful to keep his tone neutral, even when he was treated disparagingly. His demeanor, straight back, head slightly raised, indicated a man of dignity. As Christine continued snorting and being rude, she didn't notice his eyes quickly assessing the situation. Michael scrutinized the waiter's actions, noting small flaws in service and doing so with the air of a man who had a right to do so. Sometimes he raised his eyebrows slightly at the sight of small lapses. Sometimes, on the contrary, he nodded approvingly, noting someone's competence. Another detail that escaped Christine's gaze was the gold ring on his right hand. It was engraved on the inside with the restaurant's logo, which could only be seen up close. This ring symbolized its owner's status and was unique, but to the indifferent waitress, it remained just a piece of jewelry. Michael's gaze stopped periodically on the portrait in the corner of the room, a picture of a group of people, including him, smiling and standing in the center. But younger, Christine was so used to that portrait that she stopped noticing it, even when it was in front of her eyes. Finally, the most important gesture she missed was Michael's slight smile as she spilled the water. It wasn't an expression of submission or fear. It was the look of a man who had already foreseen where this evening would lead and knew that everything would come to pass. When Christine returned to her desk after another visit with other clients, she had a subtle evil grin on her face. She stood with a slight forward lean that made her posture threatening and deliberately confident. Her gaze was barbed, and a thin line of contempt played on her lips. Her body radiated displeasure, and even those nearby could feel the tension building in the air. "Are you ready to order?" Her words came out with an emphasis on the last word, as if ordering from this customer was an unnecessary burden for her. The words slid down the hall, carrying with them an icy tinge of mockery. Michael looked up again and nodded briefly, selecting a dish from the menu, but before he could speak, Christine interrupted him, raising one hand in a gesture that showed her interest in the situation was minimal. "Hold on, dessert. I hope you realize that this isn't a diner where you can just sit down for a glass of water. People come here to enjoy the real food." She raised her voice deliberately so that a few customers at nearby tables began to furtively glance around. There was an awkward silence for a few seconds as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Michael looked at her, taking his time, and answered calmly, "I understand." Christine grinned even wider, showing her disdain openly. She fixed a strand of hair that had fallen into her face, doing so with such ostentatious indifference that she seemed to want to emphasize that this situation was just a game to her. "Well, thank God," she added sarcastically and winked at her colleague, who was standing at the bar, trying to hide a smile. This wink and the light laughter of Christine and her colleague were the last straw for those who were watching from the sidelines. The atmosphere in the room was getting tenser by the second, like a stream ready to burst. The couple at the next table exchanged concerned glances. Some averted their eyes, preferring not to interface. Michael, however, remained where he was, maintaining the same calm expression, and it was beginning to worry Christine a little. Michael Saturday at the table, outwardly calm, though a storm of emotions raged inside him. He was a man accustomed to challenges and able to hold his own in the most difficult situations. Years of working in business, facing bias and hidden forms of racism had hardened his character and taught him to keep his composure even when injustice stared him in the face. His gaze was soft but intense, with a slight spark of understanding that would alert anyone who noticed it. Michael was a master of observation, able to read people, to understand their motives, to catch the smallest changes in their facial expressions and movements. And now he was concentrating on Christine's every gesture, noting her haughty tone, her sneers, and her meaningful glances in the direction of her co-workers. He knew that every gesture she made was a challenge to the idea that she was a person without weight or influence. Inwardly, Michael felt anger, a burning, corrosive anger for all the times he or others had been judged by appearance, ignoring merit, experience, and humanity. But that anger was contained. Like an avalanche, he learned to keep under control. It was important to him not to react immediately, not to be tempted to respond with harshness to harshness. He realized that every second of his silence and serenity was adding to the tension and making Christine nervous, even if she tried to hide it. Michael nodded slightly, slowly tilting his head to take a sip of water. His movements were unhurried and deliberate, as if he were showing everyone around him that time flowed differently for him. He was the master of this situation, even if it seemed that he was just a customer facing humiliation. This silent protest was disturbing, almost imperceptible, but palpable to anyone who dared to watch this scene long enough. His hands, resting on the table, were relaxed, but the muscles in his shoulders and back were tense. A small detail that could only be noticed if you looked closely. Michael used the pause to remind himself why he had come to this restaurant tonight, why he had allowed himself to be a part of the scene. He didn't need to raise his voice or give in to emotion. His presence and composure were eloquent enough. The moment Christine finished her derogatory comment with a venomous grin, the room was filled with a peculiar, oppressive silence. Even the clinking of glasses and the rustling of instruments seemed to have subsided, giving way to the tension that had spread throughout the restaurant. The eyes of the diners gradually began to shift from their plates and interlocutors to what was happening at the table in the corner, where a scene more like a play was unfolding. The couple at the next table furtively looked at Michael and Christine. The woman, her lips slightly pressed together, cast a worried glance at her companion. However, preferred to lower his eyes and pretend that nothing was going on. The man shook his head slightly, as if to say, "It's better not to interface." But their silence was filled with understanding. They knew it was wrong, but they didn't dare to do anything about it. The two young men sitting behind the bar were whispering and giggling, watching the scene with genuine interest. For them, this scene was a kind of entertainment, a way to dilute the routine of the evening. One of them glanced at Christine with admiration, as if her behavior were an example of boldness and confidence. In the far corner of the room, an elderly man, who sat alone, watched carefully from under his gray eyebrows. He quietly set his fork aside, his gaze heavy and filled with judgment. He didn't know Michael or Christine, but he saw something all too familiar in this scene that brought back bitter memories. His hand clenched involuntarily into a fist, but, like the others, he chose to remain silent, not to interface. The restaurant staff, who were free from table service, threw brief glances at each other, full of hidden emotions. One of the waiters, a young guy with freckles, frowned slightly, but then, noticing the manager's gaze, quickly turned away, continuing his work. The manager, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, watched the situation with a stone face, as if weighing whether to intervene or let Christine handle the situation herself. Some of the visitors, who noticed the obvious humiliation, looked uncomfortable and fidgeted nervously in their seats. A few women exchanged expressive glances of displeasure and compassion for Michael. One of them, plucking up courage, muttered to her companion, "How is this possible? Why won't anyone stop her?" But the answer never came. The general atmosphere in the restaurant was now tense, like a thin thread stretched to the limit. Everyone knew that something was about to happen to break the silence, but no one dared to make the first move. With each new visit Christine made to Michael's table, her behavior became more and more defiant. She clearly enjoyed the fact that she could manipulate the atmosphere in the room, using it as a platform for her humiliation. Her every gesture, every word suggested that she was not just a waitress, but some kind of judge whose opinion of the customers mattered. When she returned to the table to see if his order was okay, she had already prepared the next batch of barbs. "Do you think we should give you time to realize that you're in a restaurant and not a roadside cafe?" she said with a nonchalant expression on her face. It wasn't just a phrase, but a clearly calibrated lunge that only added to the tension that already existed. Michael paused, collecting his thoughts, and tried to keep his composure again. Though he was seething inside, he felt the other visitors watching his reaction with interest and sometimes even sympathy, but he didn't know how to respond to this reproach. At that time, Christine started rubbing her hands together, as if she was getting ready for the next performance. She deliberately delayed his order, ignoring his appeals and even refusing to look in his direction. From time to time, she stopped at the tables of other customers, provoking their laughter with her jokes about how some customers don't even understand what good cuisine is. Her words came out loud and clear, so that even the quietest conversations in the room were silenced when she passed by. The next visit was the culmination of her behavior. Christine, returning to the table, glanced at his empty plate and said mockingly, "You didn't seem to have any difficulty other than sneering at others, but food isn't for everyone, is it?" Michael, despite his best efforts, couldn't hide his confusion. Christine continued to emphasize his silence, as if she was waiting for him to react, as if it was her way of controlling the situation. As she tried to throw him off balance, her smugness became more and more apparent. Christine walked around the table, stood behind Michael, and grinned. "I hope you don't expect me to bring you bread, no matter how hard you try to impress." And at that moment, one of the visitors could not resist and said quietly, "This is too much." Christine replied with a disgruntled look, raising her eyebrows as if disapproving of the intrusion. In this repetitive cycle of humiliation, the tension seemed to reach a climax, but Christine continued, as if unaware of how the air was dying down, how every comment she made only fanned the flames of resentment toward her in the eyes of those around her. She was completely unaware that every new gesture and word she made only strengthened the authority and firmness of Michael, who watched her behavior with his usual restraint and wariness. A struggle was brewing inside Christine that no one around her could see. Despite her confident outward demeanor, she was not only a waitress, but also a woman who was experiencing her own inner conflicts and fears. Difficult relationships with her parents, worries about her financial future, and a desire to be seen and accepted created an invisible barrier in her soul that she projected onto the world around her. Christine grew up in an environment where social status and appearance determine a person's worth. Her parents, highly ambitious people, often discussed the successes and shortcomings of others, sparing no words to humiliate those who did not meet their standards. Such conversations shaped Christine's prejudiced perception. She believed that weakness, poverty, or even just an inappropriate style of dress made a person unworthy of respect. So when she saw Michael, a black man in an expensive suit, come into her restaurant, she could not see him as an equal. Every derogatory word thrown at him was a way for her to assert herself. She felt superior when she could afford the ridicule and disdain, which temporarily helped to dull her own fears. Deep down, Christine knew that this behavior was wrong, but the inner conflict made her feel light and free to exercise her power over someone from time to time. Christine was also afraid that she herself might become an object of ridicule and humiliation. She was surrounded by colleagues who often discussed the wrong types of clients, and Christine was afraid of being part of the conversation. To survive in this competitive environment, she needed to follow the rules. Even if it meant humiliating others, she saw humiliation as a defense mechanism. If someone was inferior to her, she could forget about her own failures for a while. Strangely enough, this internal barrier also served as a kind of justification for her behavior. Christine genuinely believed that this was how she demonstrated her competence and professionalism. She thought that humiliating a client could strengthen her authority in the eyes of her colleagues. She thought that by behaving aggressively towards inappropriate clients, she was raising her importance in the team. Each jab at Michael only confirmed her perception that she had the right to speak her mind about others, as if speaking her mind was the only way she could assert herself in her role. Deep down, however, Christine realized that these actions were only a temporary solution. She felt her inner world filling with anxiety and emptiness. But every time she was about to stop, every time her conscience raised its voice, she again sought solace in her humiliating jokes, sinking herself deeper and deeper into this mask. There was no way out in this vicious circle of humiliation she had created for herself, and she seemed to lose contact more and more with the reality in which people were equal and worthy of respect, regardless of skin color or status. That evening, the tension in the restaurant reached its climax. Christine, who had long been absorbed in the humiliation, was now ready to make a move that would finally define her as the owner of the situation. Perplexed looks continued to be observed all around, but she no longer paid any attention to them. Something cold and insistent flashed in her eyes. She was determined that Michael should not expect the slightest sympathy or respect from her. Michael, feeling the growing tension, realized that he had to try to change the course of events. After a long pause, he pulled himself together and looked into Christine's eyes and said, "I'm sorry, but I'd like to order another course." His voice was confident, but there was a tiredness in it from the constant confrontation. He had hoped that this simple request would be an opportunity to change the tone of their conversation, but Christine only grinned in response. She clearly had no intention of giving in, and feeling that her self-respect was at stake, she stepped forward to demonstrate that she was still mistress in this establishment. "Oh, are you sure that's a good idea? I don't know if we have room for such gourmet orders," she said with vain joy. Looking around the room, her tone became sharply mocking, and at that moment, it became obvious to Michael that her reaction was not just offensive, but purposefully derogatory. "I'm just asking you to do your job and provide me with a menu," he replied, trying to remain calm, though he was beginning to hear a hint of irritation in his voice. Christine, however, heard this and crossed her arms over her chest, tilting her head to the side as if listening to a minor objection. "You know, we don't have many places to request additional service, and I don't like your tone. Perhaps you should consider whether to continue your presence here," she said dismissively. Every word she said sounded like a punch. Silence grew in the room, and those around her began to realize that this was not just a conflict between a customer and a waitress, but more than that, it was a clear demonstration of racial bias and humiliation. Michael, shocked by her refusal, felt his face burn with anger. He realized that his request was perfectly normal and reasonable. He was not going to give in to Christine's provocations and became more determined. "I'm not going to leave your establishment without what I'm owed. I'm asking you to please do your job." His voice became firm, ready to assert his rights. Christine, however, only sneered, a twinkle of insolence in her eyes that said she had no intention of backing down. She turned and, with one last contemptuous glance, headed off to the other customers, leaving Michael bewildered and confused. This denial of service was the real culmination of their confrontation, paving the way for new, even deeper consequences. The stares of those around them clarified the situation. People realized that this was not just about a conflict between a waitress and a customer, but about how equality and respect can be violated in simple, everyday interactions. In that moment, Christine had unknowingly taken a step toward her own destruction, and Michael had taken a step toward showing that silence and ignoring would no longer be acceptable. With each new humiliation from Christine, the tension in the room became more palpable. As the waitress turned away to other tables to fiddle with his bill, Michael felt the whispers growing around him. He had a strange feeling that the eyes of those around him were piercing him, and he couldn't help but notice how the restaurant staff were glancing around and whispering among themselves as if it were some kind of spectacle. Occasionally, he managed to catch some phrases from their conversations. One of the waiters, a tall guy with dark hair who was standing nearby, said, "I can't believe she's doing it so openly. Isn't he ashamed?" At the same time, another girl, her coworker, whispering to him, added, "Yeah, but he's definitely not like us. Maybe he shouldn't even be here." Michael felt his insides tighten. The words, filled with prejudice and judgment, were like a blow to his dignity. He realized that he was being looked at as an object of discussion, and that only made him feel more rejected. Meanwhile, Christine continued her game, not noticing or perhaps ignoring the stares and whispers of her colleagues, but she began to feel a kind of inner trepidation when she realized that Michael's excitement might be more than just a sign of weakness. As if anticipating another humiliation, she headed resolutely to the bar to order new drinks, ignoring the atmosphere that was heating up around them. Michael, meanwhile, noticed several employees exchanging angry glances, and a ripening rage crept into his chest. He didn't want this to become a public humiliation, but deep down he felt that what was going on was not just a personal conflict, but a real demonstration of a problem he was not the first to face in his life. How many times had he already felt the burden of prejudice and judgment that he had to wade through? At that moment, a clear thought arose in his mind. His silence and restraint were no longer an option. He realized that, despite all the stares and whispers, he could not afford to become a victim of this humiliating game. His face hardened as he decided that he would defend not only himself, but the dignity of every person who had ever been subjected to such humiliation. As Michael stood up, he suddenly realized that not only the restaurant staff were waiting for his reaction, but all the other guests who were now fully aware of what was happening. He couldn't let shame and fear overcome him. Every breath he took, every movement he made was no longer his alone. They were part of something bigger, part of the fight for equality and respect that he was about to defend. When Michael got up from the table, his intention was clear. He was not going to let Christine humiliate herself and continue this theatrical performance that had become her entertainment. He noticed how the conversations in the room began to subside, and not only the staff, but also the other guests of the restaurant took notice of him. However, Christine, seeing his determination, decided that this moment was her chance. Her pride and ego could not allow her to admit error or weakness. She clenched her jaw and turned to Michael, a sharpness in her voice that no one in the room had ever heard before. "Oh, look at him," she said, her voice high and shrill, catching the attention of everyone nearby. "Thinks he can just up and make me work for him. Do you even know where you are? This isn't your hole. It's a fine restaurant, and this is no place for the likes of you." Her words rang out like thunder. The guests, who had been whispering among themselves earlier, now frowned in bewilderment, unable to believe their ears. Some began to look at each other, shock and protest on their faces, but no one dared to interface, because in their minds this was a personal drama. Christine, sensing this wave of support from those around her, continued with growing excitement. "Maybe you should go back where you came from and dare not show your face here again. We don't need your orders if they go along with your mentality." There was an anger in her voice that she couldn't hide any longer. The aggression that came out wasn't just a confrontation with Michael, but some dark prick of her inner insecurity and self-loathing. She could feel the shame and fear building up in her chest, but instead of admitting it, she decided to strike first. All eyes were now fixed on her, like a scene from a drama. She stood with her hands on her hips, as if to draw all eyes to herself, and continued in the same manner. "If you can't behave like a normal person, you don't belong here." Her voice echoed through the room. This phrase was the true blow. There was silence in the hall, full of oppressive expectation. Everyone present realized that what was happening had long since gone beyond the usual conflict between a waitress and a customer. It had become a revelation of racial hatred, neglect, and indifference. Michael, feeling his heart beat faster, continued to keep his gaze on Christine. Now he didn't just want to respond to her attack. He knew that he had to take control of the situation and use this opportunity to open the eyes of others to the problems that everyone seemed to be trying to ignore. That sharp meeting of eyes between him and Christine was the spark that could lead to a real explosion. Christine, sensing that her words had resonated, began to realize that her drama had taken an unexpected turn. The silence in the room became more and more tense, and as she looked around, she saw many surprised and judgmental looks directed at her. A conflict was brewing inside her. Her pride said she should continue to defend her words, but her instinct for self-preservation said it might be wise to try to smooth things over, especially when her name and reputation were on the line. She quickly gathered her thoughts and, taking a few deep breaths, tried to change her tactics. Her face became less aggressive, but her eyes still showed stubbornness and resistance. She decided to use the moment to pretend in public that she was sorry for what had happened. "You know," she began, her voice less shrill but still tinged with a touch of arrogance, "I don't mean this to come across as an insult. It's just so difficult when people don't understand how to behave in decent society. I'm sure you Her words seemed deliberately aimed at humiliation. Have experienced similar situations. It's important for our institution to maintain certain standards. Her tone had turned sympathetic, but it felt sarcastic. She tried to give the illusion of sympathy, but her words sounded like she was bullying him even higher, emphasizing his unacceptable behavior. Everyone around her continued to stare at her, waiting to see how she would get out of this situation. In the back of her mind, Christine hoped that this feigned regret could somehow get her back in control of the situation. Michael felt a wave of anger rising inside him. He could see how her attempt to prove herself a good waitress was really just another manipulation. She wasn't apologizing for what she said, but trying to make him look guilty that she thought he wasn't good enough for this restaurant. "You don't have to apologize for coming here for dinner," he said, trying to stay calm, though his emotions were raging inside him. "I'm not going to put up with it." Christine, confused for a second, tried to go back to her manipulation tactics. "Of course, I understand how hard it is to be in a foreign city and not know how to behave, but please try to adapt to our standards if you want to continue your visits," she added with a sincere but shrewd look, as if suggesting to him that he wasn't good enough to be in her world. These words of hers caused mixed feelings among those present. Some began to whisper, others exchanged glances of doubt and judgment. At this moment, Christine was trying to mislead everyone, but Michael knew that such a mask could no longer hide her true face. He was ready to join the fight to finally show everyone how easy it was to cover up their own ignorance with hypocrisy and pretense. Michael, feeling the tension building, decided it was time to put an end to this humiliation. Christine, though trying to save face, had already taken many steps toward the absurd. Her feigned regret and arrogance only confirmed his suspicions that she was not ready for a true conversation about equality and respect. He gathered his courage and stared directly into her eyes, unable to hide his determination any longer. He didn't need to explain his worth or his place in this society. He just wanted her to understand who he was dealing with. "You know," he began slowly, choosing his words carefully so that they sounded powerful and convincing. "I'm not just a customer. This place is not just a place for me to dine. I know how business is done, and I realize how important it is to treat all my customers with dignity." Christine frowned, speechless for a second. She hadn't expected her victim to react this way. Looking at his confident expression, she felt her arrogance begin to crack. "Your job here is not only to bring food, but also to make people happy. And it's not just about the food. It's about how we communicate with each other," he continued, emphasizing each word as if he were pounding a hammer on a rough surface. "I think you've forgotten that, and that's very sad." Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice lower and more serious. "I own several restaurants, and I know what real service should look like. I hope you realize that your behavior here may have consequences you don't even realize." At that moment there was silence in the hall. People began to look at each other, realizing that they were facing not just a guest, but a person with a voice and influence. Christine couldn't believe what was happening. Her hypocrisy and arrogance had lost their power, as if a light had broken through the dark clouds of her own prejudices. She tried to defend herself again, but the words stuck in her throat. Michael's gaze was hard and penetrating, and in that moment, she realized that he knew what he was talking about. Her intention to humiliate him had actually turned against her, and now she was in a vulnerable position. "I hope you'll take that to heart, and maybe next time you talk to someone, you remember that you don't know their story. They may be much more significant than they seem at first glance." He finished, holding his gaze. Michael returned to his table, leaving Christine confused and the others in shock. Their faces showed the realization that what had happened was much deeper and more meaningful than a simple conflict between a waitress and a customer. And in that moment, they witnessed the true power that lies not just in words, but in how we choose to treat each other. The restaurant manager, James, watched from afar. It was his responsibility to supervise the staff and ensure high standards of service. He knew perfectly well that nothing like this should happen in the restaurant, but at the same time, his own reaction was blurred between professional ethics and personal biases. When Christine raised her voice, drawing the attention of the other visitors, James felt his heart beat faster. He knew that his share of responsibility in this incident could have been quite significant. However, instead of stepping in and diffusing the conflict, he decided to stay where he was, observing the situation with an expression of neutrality on his face. He didn't want to set a precedent that might affect his authority among the staff, but his instincts told him that there was more to this than just a conflict between a waitress and a customer. He noticed how the assembled customers were watching the events unfold with interest, and it created an atmosphere of mild tension. As Michael, confidently asserting his status as owner, returned to his desk, James caught his gaze for a moment. It was the moment they met eyes, and in that look James saw not only anger, but defiance. He felt that the situation needed to be controlled before it got out of hand. Nevertheless, he was in no hurry to intervene, trying to see how events might unfold. Inwardly, he wondered, what if this turns out to be an important lesson for all of us? Maybe Christine needs this, but at the same time, he realized that remaining indifferent was also a kind of decision, and the consequences could be serious. Watching Christine, he saw her confidence shake. Her face reflected emotions ranging from aggression to embarrassment, and then she realized that her behavior might have cost her more than just a conflict with a customer. Everyone around her began to realize that she hadn't just lost face, but had ruined the atmosphere of the place. At one point, as Michael spoke his last words about remembering human dignity, James finally couldn't help himself. He walked slowly to the table, deciding that it was time to show authority and show that the administration was taking serious action. "I apologize for the situation," he said, trying to remain calm, but his voice was firm enough to draw attention to himself. "I wouldn't want this place to become a place of conflict or humiliation. Every customer deserves respect, and I thank you for your tolerance." Christine looked at him in disgust, but it paid no attention. He continued, "I'll talk to you later," he said, turning to her. "And I apologize to you," he said to Michael, nodding reproachfully. "I'll do my best to make sure it doesn't happen again." Having said that, James turned back to his duties, leaving Christine in a state of shock and distress. He knew he needed to have a serious conversation with her about the importance of respecting every person, regardless of their background or appearance. When he stepped back, the room was silent again, but this time it was filled with new expectations. The visitors began to exchange opinions about what was happening, and for some it became clear that true change begins at moments like this. As Christine stood contemplating the situation, her confidence began to dissipate. The arrogance with which she'd been dismissive of the customer suddenly began to crack, and anxious thoughts began to stir in her mind. Michael's words about owning several restaurants rang in her ears like thunder. Something inside her clicked. She remembered hearing earlier about how important it was to take care of customers, especially when they looked different than most. Her prejudice against Michael was now a source of inner turmoil. She glanced at him again and noticed the way he talked to the other customers, his confidence and ease of conversation making her increasingly suspicious. Christine realized that her behavior could have consequences far more serious than she had ever anticipated. She suddenly remembered how some establishments prided themselves on their reputation among high-profile customers and how important it was for owners to attract and retain such customers. But the more she thought about it, the more her anxiety grew. She noticed how the other waiters began to act more respectful when they saw Michael. Their attentive glances and efforts to make a good impression on the man seemed suspicious to her. Maybe he really is someone important. A thought flashed through her mind. It began to stir up anxiety in her, and she began to realize that her flippant attitude might have cost her her job. Christine remembered hearing conversations about restaurant owners, what their preferences were, and that they often visited anonymously to make sure of the quality of service. Her heart raced and she began to bite her lip, realizing she had missed an important point. What if this is the exact owner that was talked about in our circle? This question never left her mind. Every word Michael had said to her now sounded different. She realized that she hadn't just insulted someone, but had possibly insulted someone who could affect her career, maybe even her life. Her face flushed red with shame as she realized that her bias and neglect may have been the cause of her downfall. She tried to get her mind off her thoughts, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a precipice. She couldn't afford to lose her job, and now that the possibility that Michael might be a powerful man occurred to her, her fear intensified. Her eyes darted between Christine and Michael, fear rising in her soul that this would be a lesson she would remember for the rest of her life. She stood motionless for a while, not knowing what to do next. Her prejudice towards the client had turned against her, and now she realized the seriousness of her transgression. Her inner voice screamed that she needed to make things right. But what steps could she take to regain respect and avoid the consequences? Questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers. When Christine realized the gravity of her actions, the fire of humiliated pride flared up in her. The internal conflict reached a climax, and she realized that her words and actions had crossed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. It wasn't just a violation of the rules, it was a disaster that put her in the spotlight, but not in the light she had dreamed of. Every second she realized that her arrogance and prejudice had made her a laughingstock. The shame was growing stronger. Her pride that had previously pushed her to act boldly was now turning against her, making her feel small and insignificant. She was beginning to realize that her behavior hadn't just upset a customer, it could jeopardize her future in this restaurant. Christine felt panic rising in her. Her hands trembled slightly and cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She had already heard talk of employees being fired for inappropriate behavior, and now that fear was her constant companion. How could she have blundered so badly? Why hadn't she thought of the consequences before letting her ego take over? She tried to console herself with the fact that they didn't deserve it, but at the same time, she realized that her excuses had no force in the face of the truth. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a conscious decision to humiliate a man she had no right to treat like that. The thought stuck in her head like a sharp needle. Christine looked at Michael again, and her heart clenched. His calmness, his confidence, his ability not to be provoked, all of it made her feel even more guilty. She saw the other visitors begin to whisper, exchanging looks of bewilderment and judgment. It only made her feel worse, and a fire of shame flared up in her soul. She began to panic, the thought creeping into her mind that her career at this restaurant could end at this point. She took a step back, took a deep breath, and tried to regain her composure. But it was difficult when every word she'd uttered earlier came back at her in the form of snide jokes, evil sneers, and judgmental glances. Christine decided that she had to fix the situation somehow. She realized that her pride was now irrelevant. She needed to approach Michael and try to apologize, but her inner fear was holding her back. How could she learn a lesson from this situation and try to change her fate? She knew she had to submit to apologize and try to mend the relationship, but there was still a lot of resistance in her mind. Emotions overwhelmed her, and on the verge of a nervous breakdown, she felt her humiliated pride begin to melt away. Perhaps this was the beginning of her true self-awareness, when one begins to realize that one's true strength lies not in suppressing others, but in showing humanity and respect. And so, standing at the threshold of a serious choice, she sensed that she was facing a difficult road to redemption. When the tension in the room gradually subsided and the conversations between the customers became quieter, Michael, sitting at the table, began to think about how exactly he had ended up here. Surprisingly, this was not just an ordinary visit to the restaurant. This was a test of sorts, a chance to see how well his business was doing and the level of service he was providing to his customers. He wasn't here as an owner, but as a discreet observer who wanted to make sure that his establishment respected every customer, regardless of their appearance. As a successful owner of several restaurants, he was no stranger to the challenges faced by those in the food service industry. He knew that such inspections were an important part of management to assess the quality of service and identify potential problems. That's why he often visited his establishments incognito in an effort to understand what was really going on. However, he had not expected to witness such a blatant display of bias and disrespect today. Sitting at his desk, he thought about the hardships and sacrifices he had endured to build his business. He knew what it was like to start from scratch and face discrimination, especially in an industry where biases and stereotypes can greatly affect success. Michael thought back to his own difficult times. He grew up in a neighborhood where racial discrimination was commonplace, and as a young boy he often faced disrespect because of the color of his skin. These experiences toughened him up and taught him the importance of respecting everyone. He has always believed that in business, especially in the restaurant business, You need to remember these lessons and create an atmosphere where every customer feels important and valued. Now, sitting at the table and watching Christine's reaction, he realized that her behavior was not random. It was a consequence of the way society had shaped her opinion of people. He wondered what could have led her to be so arrogant and demeaning toward people who she felt didn't fit her idea of the right clients. He felt anger as well as regret, realizing that her demeaning of others was the result of her own ignorance. At that moment, Michael decided that this was his chance to change not only her life, but the entire culture of his institution. He didn't want to just punish her, he wanted to give her the opportunity to understand that true greatness and success were not dependent on skin color or status. This was an opportunity for her to learn and grow as a professional and as a person. As he rose from his seat and walked to the counter to speak to the manager, he felt like his mission at this restaurant was just beginning. He intended to have a frank conversation with Christine about what it meant to be a part of this business, the importance of valuing each customer, and how bias could ruin both personal lives and entire establishments. Michael didn't know what the ending to this story would be, but he definitely realized that everyone deserved a second chance. Maybe this would be the lesson Christine could learn from the situation, and maybe this would be the beginning of her transformation from misunderstanding to understanding, from arrogance to respect. When the news that Michael was the owner of the restaurant began to spread among the staff, the atmosphere in the establishment instantly changed. At first, it was a quiet whisper, and then, like a snowball, the information grew to the level of comprehensive shock. Waiters, cooks, and other employees who had previously been indifferent to the conflict suddenly felt part of something bigger. Christine, who had just realized how wrong she was standing waiting for the consequences of her actions when a new wave of realization hit her. Her co-workers began exchanging glances, and in those glances you could catch a mixture of surprise, pity, and most importantly, judgment. Rumors of who Michael was had quickly reached every corner of the restaurant, and now every one of the employees who had stayed away were beginning to wonder how they could have been so blind. Manager James, who had previously been slow to intervene, now realized that the situation required his attention. He gathered all the employees to explain the importance of respecting customers, regardless of their status or appearance. He began to talk about how they all worked in an industry where trust and respect for customers was the foundation of a successful business. At this point, everyone realized that this wasn't just a lesson for Christine, it was a lesson for everyone. The workers' faces showed expressions of bewilderment and shame. The waiter, who had been laughing with Christine at her jokes, now realized how wrong his behavior had been. He looked at Michael, who was sitting at the table with a nonchalant expression on his face, and felt the shame wash over him. They all began to realize that Michael was not only a successful owner, but a man who could have been in a similar situation had it not been for his tenacity and desire to change his fate. Employees who had previously walked past Christine now began to look over at each other, realizing that such misconduct could affect every one of them. The fear of the possibility of losing their jobs and reputations suddenly became very real. Everyone realized that such actions could not only damage individual careers, but also affect the success of the institution as a whole. As they discussed what had happened, the workers began to realize that they were all part of the same team, and every mistake could affect their common cause. Now that they saw who was really in front of them, the deceptive facade of confidence with which Christine had approached the client revealed its true nature. Instead of indifference to the situations they faced on a daily basis, they began to realize that they needed to act in a spirit of unity and understanding. Gathered in a small group, some of the waiters began to discuss how they could support Christine. They realized that her actions were not only caused by personal beliefs, but also by stereotypes that they themselves may have reproduced in their conversations and actions. They began to realize that they should become more open-minded and learn to respect everyone who crossed their path. This unspoken lesson about the importance of mutual understanding, respect, and humanity became a kind of turning point for all employees of the restaurant. An evening that began with conflict became a time of rethinking, when everyone began to ask the question, how can we be better? As a result, the atmosphere in the restaurant began to change, transforming it from a place where neglect and prejudice found a place to a place of respect and understanding. Sitting at the table, Michael pondered the consequences of his actions. He was in a quandary. His emotions fluctuated between anger and understanding. On the one hand, he deeply resented Christine's behavior, but on the other hand, he couldn't ignore the fact that she was a product of a system that itself bred biases. He wanted this situation to be not just a lesson for Christine, but an opportunity for growth and change. After discussions with the manager and other employees, he decided that it was important not only to punish, but also to give her a chance to make amends. He wanted Christine to realize the seriousness of her actions and learn from what had happened, but he did not want to leave her without a chance for redemption. The next day, Michael gathered the entire restaurant staff and announced that he wanted to talk about what had happened. He wasn't going to hide his displeasure. He told Christine that her behavior was unacceptable and that she needed to understand how her words and actions could affect others. Instead of firing her, however, he suggested that she take a special course in respect and inclusion training so that she could better understand how her behavior reflected on the entire team and client base. This decision caused shock among the staff, but also relief. Many employees began to realize that Michael was not seeking revenge, but wanted each of them to be better. Christine, for her part, felt her heart squeezed with shame and gratitude. She couldn't believe that she had been given a second chance, although she realized that now she had the opportunity to change her attitude and become more open to others. Working with her new knowledge and skills, she began to see the world from a different perspective. Gradually, her self-confidence improved and, most importantly, she realized how important it is to respect every client, regardless of their race or status. This experience was not only a personal lesson for her, but also a chance to rethink her place in society. A few months passed, and Kristen developed into one of the best employees in the restaurant. She learned not only how to provide professional service, but also how to genuinely care for people. Every day she tried to be the best version of herself and did her best to create a positive atmosphere for the customers. Michael watched her grow and was proud that his decision was not just an act of mercy, but a strategic step toward creating a healthier work environment. He knew that people can change if given the opportunities to do so, and his decision to forgive instead of harshly punishing her not only saved Christine's career, but also boosted the spirit of the entire team. Thus, the story of the conflict in the restaurant ended not as a simple confrontation, but as a vivid example of how important forgiveness and understanding are in combating prejudice and racism. The process of redemption that began with a single mistake became a powerful engine of change that affected not only the individual but the entire community. When Christine realized that her actions were not only unreasonable but also destructive, a wave of emotion came over her. She sat her day in the corner of the restaurant, feeling anger at herself boiling in her chest. Her hands trembled and her eyes filled with tears. The moment the truth about Michael had come out, her world had turned upside down. At first, she was overcome with a feeling of fear. She could not believe that by her words and actions, she could have insulted the man she now knew to be the owner of the establishment. The feeling of shame became unbearable. How could she have acted so short-sightedly? Her mind replayed the words she had spoken, and she couldn't shake the thought that now she had no chance of forgiveness. As soon as she realized that Michael was the one she'd humiliated, her heart sank with despair. Tears began to flow down her cheeks, and she covered her face with her hands, unable to contain her emotions. Each tear was full of remorse and guilt. She felt that she had not only let herself down, but also let down all her colleagues who looked at her with judgment and bewilderment. Christine looked up, and seeing the other employees whispering among themselves made it even harder for her. They weren't just co-workers, they were her friends who had once trusted her. She realized that her actions had driven them apart and questioned their belief in respect and humanity. When she finally gathered enough strength to stand up, she made her way to the table where Michael was sitting. Her steps were tentative, and emotions were still raging in her chest. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I wasn't thinking about what I was saying. I made a mistake." At that moment, she realized that the word sorry wasn't enough to express her remorse. She wanted him to know that she really cared, and that she was willing to work on herself to be the best she could be. But fear of Michael's reaction was holding her back. She expected him to turn away or say something hurtful to her, but instead she saw understanding in his eyes. Michael, pondering her words, replied calmly, "We all make mistakes, Christine. It's important that we learn from those mistakes." His answer pleased her, but at the same time filled her with fear. Words of encouragement couldn't erase the pain she had caused others. Christine realized that the road to redemption would be a long one. She wanted others to know that she recognized her mistakes and was willing to change. "I will work on myself, I promise," she said, her voice full of determination. The tears continued to flow, but now they were tears of hope. Christine knew that she would have to regain the trust of her colleagues and clients. Her inner desire to correct her mistakes and learn to respect others became her new guide. This situation changed her forever. She realized that only by accepting her mistakes and going through the pain could she become stronger. And perhaps this journey, which began with tears and apologies, would lead her to become not just a better employee, but a better person. When Christine approached Michael to apologize, the attention of everyone in the restaurant was riveted on this tense scene. There was silence in the room, broken only by the rustling of cutlery and the whispering of a few people. Each of the customers present at the moment perceived what was happening in a different way, and these reactions were full of variety. Some customers, noticing the tension between the waitress and the owner, began exchanging overawed glances full of curiosity and slight shock. They listened to every word, trying to understand exactly what had happened. Many of them had witnessed the humiliation Christine had inflicted on her customer, but none of them had expected it to be the owner of the establishment. The customer in the corner, an elderly man with a thick white beard, commented quietly, "How easily people judge by appearances." His words were full of regret, and in them was heard the wisdom that came with experience. He knew how prejudice could ruin lives, and this event only confirmed his beliefs. A young couple sitting at a table not far from Christine exchanged glances full of bewilderment and anxiety. They saw the waitress trying to smooth things over, but couldn't see if she could regain her confidence. "Doesn't she realize what she's doing?" the girl whispered to her companion, and there was a mixture of sympathy and condemnation in her voice. They knew that it would be extremely difficult to correct such a mistake, and they felt sorry for Christine, but at the same time they felt that she deserved this lesson. Younger visitors sitting at a neighboring table were actively discussing what was happening, trying to make out all the details. "This is just unreal. How could you not think of the consequences like that?" exclaimed one of the girls in surprise, condemnation sounding in her voice. Her friend, nodding, added, "Good thing he wasn't shy about showing who he really was." "That was awesome." They both marveled at how Michael, despite his stance, wasn't going to retaliate, but decided to give it a chance to get better. Some clients, who had previously not even paid attention to the conflict, began to realize the importance of respect in society. They saw how prejudice and racism can manifest themselves in small things, and it made them think about their own prejudices. One of the men sitting at the table with his colleagues quietly remarked, "This is a good lesson for all of us. We need to remember that our words can hurt." When Christine uttered her apology, the atmosphere in the restaurant became more tense. Customers watched her reaction, searching for sincerity in her. With every minute that Christine realized her mistakes and every minute that Michael showed his willingness to forgive, the customers began to feel that what was happening had meaning not only for the situation, but also for themselves. As if in unison, many clients began to talk about the importance of learning from their mistakes and the need for respect and understanding. The situation became not just a personal drama, but also a lesson for everyone who was present. Each of them left the restaurant not only with an impression of a delicious meal, but also with an important reminder that humanity and respect should be the foundation of any interaction. Thus, by observing the reactions of others, it was possible to realize that this story became a kind of mirror for the visitors, which reflected their own inner beliefs and biases. The event in the restaurant left its traces on everyone, making them think about how they could change their lives and the society around them. When all eyes were focused on Michael, he stood up to speak his thoughts. The atmosphere in the restaurant became tense and full of anticipation. Customers and employees were waiting to hear what he had to say, and this moment was the key to the story they were all experiencing. Michael took a deep breath and, glancing at Christine, began his monologue. "I want you all to realize that what happened here today is not just a situation between a waitress and a customer. It's so much more than that. It's about how we perceive each other, how we judge people by their appearance, and how we often let bias and stereotypes drive our actions. His voice was full of strength and confidence, but there was also a softening in it as he continued. We were all born different in skin color, culture, background, but that shouldn't define our worth as human beings. Each of us has the right to be treated with respect and dignity. As the owner of this restaurant, I want everyone who crosses our threshold to feel at home, but to do that, I need your help. He looked at the staff, including Christine, and continued, we have to be careful with our words and actions. When we allow ourselves to laugh or judge people because of their appearance, we not only humiliate them, but we become part of the problem ourselves. We cannot turn a blind eye to bias and racism. We have to be the ones who make a difference, who stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. Christine listened, and tears began to gather in her eyes again. She realized that her actions were not just hurting one person. They were a reflection of a broad problem that affected many. Each of you, Michael continued, should ask yourself the question, how can I make this place a better place? How can I show respect and understanding to the people around me? We're all here to learn from each other. And it's not just about what happens inside these walls, but what we bring to the world outside of them. He closed his eyes, gathering his thoughts. I don't want any of you to repeat the mistakes that were made today. I believe in the possibility of change, and I hope you do too. We can create a work environment where everyone feels valued and important, where no one fears for their dignity. And to do that, we need to be open to change. After these words, there was silence in the hall. Every attendee, every staff member was immersed in their own thoughts. They realized that these were not just words. They were a call to action, an opportunity to rethink their views on racism and bias. Michael, realizing that his monologue was not just an expression of personal feelings, but a lesson for everyone, added, I hope that each of you can take something important from this lesson for yourselves. Let's make our restaurant a place where everyone is respected, where openness and kindness become the norm, not the exception. When he finished, Christine felt her heart fill with hope. Her realization of her own mistakes and the owner's word had helped her realize that change was possible if you put in the effort. She looked at her co-workers, expecting them to support this new philosophy that Michael offered as a basis for further work. At that moment, there was a real change in the restaurant. Not only in Christine's attitude, but also in the attitude of everyone who witnessed the event. Watching the people who realized their responsibility, Michael felt that his words had reached everyone's heart, and this was the beginning of a new path for the whole team, to a path of understanding, respect, and unity. After Michael delivered his powerful monologue about racism and respect, the atmosphere in the restaurant changed. It wasn't just a temporary lull. By this point, a new dynamic had already formed that affected every member of the team and their interactions with customers. The staff who were watching the events unfold began to reconsider their own attitudes and behaviors. This was especially true for Christine. Her realization of her own mistakes and her desire to improve became an example for the others. Her colleagues saw her sincere efforts to mend relationships, and this inspired them to make their own changes. Gradually, a supportive atmosphere began to emerge as employees began to share their thoughts about racism and bias, discussing how they could become more open and considerate to customers and each other. The new dynamic was also evident in the way employees began to work together. Team spirit was strengthened and employees began to trust each other more. They started having small meetings to discuss how they could improve their service and make the restaurant a friendlier place for everyone. Each of them wanted to be part of this change, and many began to talk openly about how important it was to respect every customer, regardless of their appearance or background. Patrons also noticed the change. Soon after the incident, the restaurant became known not only for its delicious food, but also for how friendly and respectful the staff treated each client. Everyone noticed that the waiters became more attentive, smiling more often and genuinely interested in whether the guests were okay. This change in service contributed to the fact that the number of regular customers began to grow, and soon the restaurant gained a reputation as a place where everyone is valued and respected. Customers who witnessed the incident said that it was an important moment for the entire establishment. They felt that the restaurant had become a more progressive and inclusive place. One such customer was a man who, sitting at a table, said, "I came here for dinner and was shocked at what happened. but now I see them working to rectify the situation, and that's respectful. Michael, observing the positive changes, felt proud of his team. He realized that this story was not only a lesson for Christine, but also for all the employees. Each of them, having witnessed the incident and the subsequent dialogue, became more aware and attentive to their actions. However, this change was not an easy process. Some staff members still had difficulty recognizing their biases. Michael organized trainings and workshops to discuss issues of racism and respect in the community. This helped many realize the importance of accepting their responsibility and being part of the solution rather than the problem. Over time, the team became more united, and their common goal was to create a safe space for everyone. Everyone understood that their job was not just about fulfilling their duties, but also about making an impact on the lives of the people who come to the restaurant. In the end, the story of one waitress humiliating her customer became the catalyst for profound change within the team. After witnessing the transformation, the staff began to develop a new understanding of respect and humanity, which in turn made the restaurant a place where customers came back not only for the delicious food, but also for the atmosphere of respect and warmth. This dynamic and new perception of work stayed with them forever, forming the basis of their interactions with customers and each other. Christine Saturday at a table in the back of the restaurant, staring at her empty plate, unable to look away from her thoughts. Her mind was in chaos, reeling from the events of the day before. A sense of shame and disappointment overwhelmed her, and even the smells coming from the kitchen no longer brought her joy. She knew that rethinking what had happened was only the first step in her inner recovery. Remembering how she treated Michael, Christine realized how far she'd gone in her preconceived notions. Her first impression of him had been based solely on his appearance, the color of his skin, and the way he dressed. She didn't see him as a person, didn't try to understand who he really was, and instead chose stereotypes that told her he didn't deserve respect. She was stuck in this vicious cycle of her own prejudices, not noticing how her actions were hurting others. Now, as the entire restaurant was immersed in a discussion of what had happened, Christine felt her inner world crumbling. She knew that she had struck a blow not only to Michael, but to the entire staff. Her behavior reflected a negative attitude that many may have shared. She realized that she had caused fear and resentment, and this realization was weighing on her like a heavy weight. As she walked through the restaurant, Christine met the gazes of colleagues who might have admired her before. Now they looked at her with bewilderment and judgment. She saw disappointment and frustration in their eyes, and it was another reminder that she needed to change. She realized that she had a hard road to travel to regain their trust. Christine decided that she would no longer hide from her responsibility. She reached out to Michael to ask to talk, and his response, full of understanding and willingness to help, was a ray of hope for her. "I know I made a mistake," she admitted. "I'm ashamed of my actions, and I want to change my behavior. I don't want anyone to ever feel the way you do." Her voice shook and her eyes filled with tears. Michael, after listening to her, reminded her that everyone makes mistakes, but it is important to be able to recognize them and strive for change. He suggested that she attend workshops and trainings where they could discuss issues of racism and bias. This was a turning point for Kristen. She realized that the road to correction would not be easy, but it would start with her willingness to learn and grow. With each workshop and each conversation with her colleagues, she became more and more aware of how much she had missed by closing herself off from the world and letting stereotypes control her behavior. Christine learned to listen to others, to understand their feelings and respect their experiences. It was a kind of restoration of her inner world, where respect for people became a top priority. Over time, Christine began to feel her internal conflicts gradually dissolve. She became an active member of the team, supporting her colleagues in their quest for respect and openness. Her own story, full of struggle and introspection, served as an example for others. She now knew that the most important thing was not to avoid difficulties, but to learn from her mistakes. Her road to correction was not smooth, but each difficulty only strengthened her desire to become a better person. She realized that respect was not just a word, but the foundation upon which all relationships are built. Christine no longer wanted to remain in the shadow of her biases. She aspired to become a person who inspires others to change and help create a society free of racism and bias. This internal struggle though full of complexities, made her stronger. Christine became a new person, and she was ready to stand up for those who faced the same problems she herself had once faced. Now her story was not only about her mistakes, but also about how everyone can find a way to mend and become a better person. The incident that took place in the restaurant was a turning point that changed not only Christine and Michael, but also the entire culture of the establishment. After the truth about the client's identity was revealed, the atmosphere in the restaurant began to change. This incident became a kind of catalyst for a major transformation, which became the basis for a new working philosophy. The first step towards change was to implement a training system for employees. Michael, realizing the importance of the topic, initiated trainings on racism, bias, and respect. He brought in professional facilitators who conducted workshops where not only theoretical aspects were discussed, but also real situations that employees might encounter. This was an important moment to create an open and honest space where everyone could express their thoughts and experiences without fear of judgment. Christine, as one of the training participants, became a strong advocate for a new culture of respect. She shared her story, showing how easy it is to make mistakes and how important it is to be able to admit your mistakes. Her openness inspired other staff to talk about their biases and stereotypes, which helped create a more cohesive team. In addition, the restaurant culture started to actively introduce the idea of inclusiveness. Michael decided to make the menu more diverse by adding dishes from different cultures. This not only enriched the gastronomic experience of the guests, but also created a sense that the restaurant was a place where all cultures were welcomed and valued. The staff began to discuss and suggest ideas, which fostered a sense of unity and sharing. There were also changes among the regular customers. Many of them, after learning about the incident and seeing how the restaurant handled the situation, began to actively support the establishment. They began to share their impressions and positive feedback about how the staff had changed and how they began to be more attentive to each client. This led to an increase in the popularity of the restaurant and an increase in the number of regular customers. Over time, the restaurant became known not only for its quality service and delicious food, but also for its open culture where everyone is respected. Many customers started coming not only for the food, but also for the unique atmosphere that the staff created. People started coming back here knowing that they could count on attentive and friendly service. Michael, watching the changes taking place in the restaurant, felt proud of his team. He realized that an incident that once seemed catastrophic had become the starting point for something bigger. It wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about creating a place where everyone felt valued and respected. Christine, having been a part of this process, realized that her journey to getting better was only the beginning. Now she could look at her changes with pride and see how they affected others. She became an example of how everyone can change and contribute to a more respectful and inclusive environment. In conclusion, this incident was not just a lesson for Christine and Michael, but the beginning of a new chapter for the entire restaurant. The changes that took place in its culture showed that respect, understanding, and openness can make an establishment a place where every welcome guest feels at home. And this new chapter was just beginning. Dear viewers, we would be very happy to hear your opinion about this story. What do you think about what happened in the restaurant? Have you had any incidents of racism or bias in your life? Your stories and thoughts are very important to us. Each of you plays a significant role in our community, and we sincerely appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new and exciting stories. Thank you for being with us, and we wish you a good day.